We're joined now by Australian clinical psychologist Lissa Johnson, who has been kind enough to come on and speak to us about Monday's events and also some of her thoughts that she has penned so very wonderfully on throughout the summer, throughout the year, on the psychology of getting Assange and specifically also torture and solitary confinement. Lissa, thank you for joining us and welcome.
Thank you for having me.
So one of the first things I wanted to ask you about was this discussion that a lot of people have been having, especially in reaction to Monday's events, that centers around whether or not Assange has been drugged or is being drugged, and that might be producing some of the effects that we saw in court on Monday. Do you have any thoughts on that? Is it exclusively drugs, or are there other reasons that we could see, Assange in the state that he was in?
Well, it's perfectly possible that he's being medicated, but the way Julian Assange presented in court on Monday, saying that he couldn't think properly, having difficulty answering simple questions, feeling confused, and all of that is entirely consistent with having been held in prolonged solitary confinement. So in fact, it's predictable, and to me, when I watched and read about Monday's proceedings, what jumped out at me was that it was a really alarming snapshot of what Niels Meltz has been warning us about for months, that Julian Assange has been showing symptoms typical for somebody who suffered a prolonged period of psychological torture. And there were aspects of solitary confinement in the Ecuadorian embassy for years, and sensory deprivation, and in Belmarsh prison that's been intensified to an extreme degree, that he's held in maximum security lockdown. And there's a solid literature on the effects of solitary confinement and sensory deprivation on people, and what it does, of course it causes distress, and I think people misunderstand how severe it is and what it does to people. So it doesn't just cause distress, it doesn't just cause loneliness, depression, boredom, learned helplessness. It does cause those things along with very serious psychiatric and psychological disturbances. But it also, in addition to that, causes severe cognitive and mental impairments and deterioration, such that people, brain activity is reduced in solitary confinement, and after just 7 days, that reduced brain activity can become permanent. In studies of people who've been held in solitary confinement, the cognitive changes, so memory impairments, concentration impairments, information processing impairments, so that people can't follow a logical thought, they can't create a coherent logical stream of thought. If you can't remember what you just said or what you just read, you can't read, you can't follow what you're reading, you can't follow what other people are saying. That's what solitary confinement and sensory deprivation and lack of stimulation does to people. In studies of people who've been held in solitary confinement for a prolonged period, as Julian Assange has, show those effects still, an array of effects for decades after the person has been released from solitary confinement. So it's really not an exaggeration to say that solitary confinement and lack of stimulation attacks the brain, and I don't think people appreciate that. The UN defines solitary confinement that lasts for more than 15 days as torture and cruel, inhuman and degrading treatment. And there's a reason for that. It's because of these long-term serious adverse effects that it has. So, the way Julian Assange presented on Monday, there's no need to speculate. I mean, perhaps there's medication, but there's no need to speculate that to explain what we saw. I think one of the reasons people don't appreciate how serious solitary confinement is that you can't see it, and you can't see the effect of it. And the reality is that opportunities for meaningful social interaction and sensory stimulation and mental stimulation aren't just nice to have; they're necessary minimum conditions for human functioning. So depriving people of that is like depriving people of food and water. Just as the body wastes away, breaks down, degenerates without food and water, the mind, the brain, its functioning degenerates and breaks down without opportunities for social interaction, stimulation. There's absolutely no reason for Julian Assange to be in maximum security lockdown. There's no rationale. There's no charge in the UK. There's no sentence. The only purpose it serves is to inflict the kind of damage that I'm talking about. So, it's expecting him to go to court after months of solitary confinement, not having been able to read. The not reading doesn't just rob him of the opportunity to prepare his defence. It's adding to that sensory deprivation, lack of stimulation, and the damage that causes to the brain. So it's like expecting somebody to go perform in the Olympics after you've held them immobilised, deprived of food and water for months. Expecting him to go to court and fight these extradition charges after months of solitary confinement, is the psychological, mental, cognitive equivalent of that. So, Nils Melzer has been warning us, and he's up against the fact that journalists, politicians, just from observing the reaction, don't understand the seriousness and the reality of psychological torture and the flow-on implications here for rule of law, for the right to a fair trial, due process, are quite profound. And I think there's two precedents being set. One's the extradition precedent, which the media and increasingly human rights organisations and legal organisations are alert to. That sets a dangerous precedent for all sorts of things, US asserting its jurisdiction across the world, media freedoms. There's also a torture precedent being set, which has its own chilling effect and its own devastating implications for rule of law, the right to a fair trial, democracy, human rights. And I think that second precedent's been grossly underappreciated in the media. And, anybody watching this in a position of influence over public opinion, any editors, any journalists, any politicians, need to really educate yourself about psychological torture, solitary confinement, and start amplifying what Nils Melzer, the UN Rapporteur on Torture, has been saying. It's very important and it's very serious. And we saw that on Monday.
Yeah, to echo those thoughts, I just want to emphasize as well that it is not over dramatizing the situation to state that Assange is being tortured. As you mentioned, Nils Melzer, we already have a very authoritative voice stating months ago that he has been and is being tortured. I don't have anything to add to that, but yeah, it's definitely not hysteria to state that.
Not at all. No. And as I say, this was foreseeable. Julian Assange's presentation on Monday. And Nils Melzer's report wasn't just based on his opinion, it was based on the Istanbul Protocol, an accepted protocol for assessing victims of torture, the opinion of a medical and psychiatric expert with extensive experience assessing victims of torture. So, they're the world's leading authorities on torture. We need to take it seriously. We need to, the fact that people are speculating drugs just speaks to how real the impact of solitary confinement and psychological torture is. It's similar. Drugs affect the brain, they impair the brain. So does psychological torture. So, it makes sense that people who don't understand what psychological torture does to people would be speculating that, because there's not good public awareness. So actually there's an excellent article, an academic paper on the effects of solitary confinement called Banning the Bing. And people can just go to Google Scholar, type in solitary confinement, banning the Bing, and it will come up. You can read the PDF. So I encourage anybody in any position of authority or influence, and just anybody, who's got friends to talk to raise awareness, to read that paper. Don't just take my word for it. Don't just take Nils Melzer's word for it and his assessment team's word for it. Read that paper for yourself. Get familiar with the evidence about solitary confinement and draw the links between that and what we saw on Monday in court. And the links between that and the fact that the authorities holding Julian Assange in maximum security lockdown, in isolation, in understimulation, that they're aware of this literature. They know what they're doing. That there is a reason that people are put into solitary confinement, and it's because, it immobilises and incapacitates them.
Yeah, it's called no-touch torture for a reason. Absolutely, you're saying. Mm-hmm. And I think that obviously we can't rule out any type of medication being used, but it's just that it's not necessary from what you're saying to explain that behaviour. Go ahead.
That's right. And even if he's being medicated, just the fact that he's been held in maximum security lockdown for all these months, those effects will be happening. I mean, that's what happens to any human being in those conditions, no matter how resilient, no matter how high functioning they were before. And it's just by virtue of being a human being. Just like no matter how fit we are physically, everyone needs food and water. Everyone needs to move their body to be healthy. Everybody needs social interaction and mental stimulation for their brain to keep functioning properly. So even if he's being drugged, that doesn't detract from the fact that all of that harm will be happening as well.
Before I hand it over to Joe, I'd like to ask one last thing, which is how, recognizing all of that, recognizing the profound degree to which he's clearly been affected by the treatment he's received, how dangerous a situation do you think he is in we know that he's obviously not your patient, you have not been able to see him in person, but in asking you to speculate a little bit, do you have any insight in how dangerous a situation, precarious a situation health-wise he might be in right now?
I think it's devastatingly serious and risky in terms of his life. What I'm going on is Nils Meltzer said that, and he had a medical and psychiatric expert assess Julian Assange months ago. So if months ago they were saying, look, he could die in UK prison as a result of the conditions he's being subjected to, now we're months later. Physically, he looked like he'd aged a lot in a short space of time, and his friends were saying that. It's a very bad sign, because psychological torture also has physical health impacts, which I should have talked about, along with the impacts on the brain. Prolonged elevation of cortisol, a stress hormone, which happens in psychological torture. It affects the immune system, cardiovascular system can be affected. People are susceptible to all sorts of very serious illnesses. And the body starts breaking down as well, just as a result of the stress of prolonged psychological torture. So, and the other thing to go on is people who know him and who've known him well, some of them for a long time, like John Pilger, his father, John Shipton, Craig Murray, have all said that they're very concerned that he may die in prison because of the changes that they're seeing in him, physical and mental and psychological. So it seems to be apparent to people who know him well that this is a very rapid, very alarming degeneration, which is consistent with what Nils Meltzer and his team warned about months ago. John Pilger, all throughout the years, has been, emphasising Julian Assange's resilience and his fighting spirit. Most people have. Now that they aren't saying that. The people who know him well are saying, actually, we're really alarmed, we're really concerned. And I think Craig Murray said that before he'd been sceptical as to whether Julian Assange really was showing signs of somebody who'd been subjected to prolonged psychological torture. And Craig Murray has seen people in his job as an ambassador who've been subjected to torture. And he said what he saw in court on Monday convinced him that, yes, he is showing symptoms consistent with that. And so we need to take all of those warnings extremely seriously. And so that's another precedent. The torture precedent could go one of two ways. One is it seriously impairs Julian Assange's ability to fight these extradition, the extradition and the charges in the US. Well, that impairs all of our ability to fight the precedents that sets. We're relying on Julian Assange and his lawyers to fight that, to save us from criminalisation of journalism and the US being able to assert its jurisdiction all over the world. So that's one precedent that could be set. The other is if he dies in UK prison, that means he's been tortured to death. And we've been warned, and if we sit silently and watch that happen, if he does die in UK prison, you can't go back from that. Then we're a society that tortures its journalists to death for publishing, because every other pretext for holding him in Belmarsh has fallen away now. It's just about the reporting on, war crimes in 2010. So people need to really think carefully about that as they sit silently while this happens. And you're talking about before, it's not over dramatic to say he's being psychologically tortured. To be honest, I don't think this is over dramatic. I feel like we're sitting in the Colosseum in Rome, watching someone being fed to the lions blindfolded with their hands tied behind their back. And people were fed to lions in the Colosseum for refusing to pledge their allegiance to the rulers of the day. That's what's happening here to Julian Assange. And so are we happy to sit there silently watching it happen, knowing that this is a litmus test? Someone else could be next. If this is allowed to happen, we better all pledge our allegiance to the leaders of the day, or suffer the consequences.
Well, to echo that, I think Pilger spoke on, I believe it was RT, about having felt that while on Thursday the week before he had visited Assange and he seemed to be in kind of fighting spirits, he said that he saw Assange on Monday in the courtroom and that it seemed his spirit had, quote, departed. I think you just cannot. I mean, that language from somebody like John Pilger, who's been so close to Assange all this time, is extremely, shocking.
It is extremely shocking. Yeah, and when he saw him on Thursday, it's the situation has different demands. Talking to an old friend who you're happy to see, something that he's been deprived of would be craving. It's very different from being in court. Your life and your future hangs on this. You need to focus. You need to, engage in complex arguments. You're under stress. It makes sense that the functioning would be different in those two situations.
Well, your analogy of the Colosseum, it becomes replete with a braying, crazed crowd that's cheering on this torture of this person. And that includes, of course, the mainstream media. And a large part of the public who have either no interest, no knowledge, or misinformation about what this case is about. So it's scary, but we've got a declining empire, so we've got something similar. It's a very good analogy. I was thinking when you were talking about what it's like to be in isolation, just think, many of us, certainly I have, I work at home sometimes, and like 2 or 3 days could go by where I don't even go out. If I've got enough food in the fridge, I start to feel very disoriented after 3 days. I have to go out and have a connection with somebody, even if it's just to go down to the shop or something. Because if you don't have a connection with another person, you start feeling weird after just 3 days. I do. So if you can imagine now what he is, and it's really began when the Ecuador embassy shut down his internet access to the world. It was when really you could say that his isolation, it was already tough being indoors, but he had lots of visitors. When that's more than 1.5 years now.
Exactly. That's right.
Now you talked about permanent damage. That's what I want to ask you about, because I think I remember Dan Ellsberg saying that Vanunu, I'm forgetting his first name right now, the guy who revealed to the public the fact that Israel has a nuclear weapons program. He, of course, was lured into a honey trap in Rome and then put on a boat and sent back to Israel, and he spent more than a decade in solitary confinement.
Oh my gosh.
And I think Dan Ellsberg said that it took him a decade to more or less come back to normal. So I just wanted you to talk to me a little bit if you know about that. Is it permanent? Can it be reversed?
It depends on the person. Like most things to do with the brain and psychological functioning and mental functioning, and there's wide variation between individuals. So, and we don't know, we can't predict who and why, and when it will be permanent or recover. I mean, one thing in general with impairment to the brain, they talk about pre-morbid functioning. So it's a bit like a physical analogy would be if you're very fit and very strong before you have an injury, you probably recover better than if you weren't very fit and very strong. Same with the brain. If you've got a very strong, very agile, very adaptable, very powerful brain, you're more likely to recover from any kind of injury, so including from solitary confinement. So on those grounds, Julian Assange would have an excellent chance of recovering, but it could take a long time. And that's just, the mental function, the cognitive function, setting aside the trauma, the psychological suffering, the social impact, there's a raft.
That's also presuming he will go free, because what you described before was, in very clear terms, he's being punished before conviction, before trial.
Yes. Yep.
He is being punished already. They have decided he's guilty, and they're punishing him now.
Very severely, and yet in a way that violates Convention Against Torture and all of his human and legal rights. In a very severe, actually violent way. It's the no-touch torture. It's still violence. It's violence against his, against his mind, against his brain, against his functioning as a human being. So, and we've talked about this before on CN Live, that's collective violence because it's a group of states, the media, society, the judiciary perpetrating that. And so it means that none of us are just bystanders, or if we're bystanders, we're part of it, because collective violence is a group activity and it relies on silent, passive bystanders, like people sitting in the Colosseum just watching, maybe clapping politely because you like to do what the authorities tell you to do. So everybody really needs to think where they want to stand on this. And, I think if most people understood understood the impact of solitary confinement, understood the legalities surrounding what's happening, understood the precedents that are being set. You know, Julian Assange's case is a litmus test for a bunch of democratic rights and freedoms that are under serious attack in Australia. It probably seems more realistic to us in Australia that this is about a serious erosion of free press, because we're quite far along that path here, legally anyway. So, you know, people aren't well informed on that, and that's not their fault. And, you know, but I encourage people to try and get well informed on that. I mean, most people watching CN Live will be well informed on the legal and human rights context, but, you know, maybe add to that some understanding of the impact of solitary confinement and psychological torture. And, you know, people who are in a position to influence others or help other people to know and understand what's going on really need to pull their finger out, because good luck looking yourself in the mirror if you don't. If you're an editor or a journalist who has some autonomy and you're staying silent about this. And I know that sounds harsh, and normally psychologists aren't harsh with people, but there are times when there are threats on the horizon and people need a metaphorical reality slap. And, you know, this is one of those times.
To ask you one more question about, are there stages that a prisoner goes through in isolation that you could recognize, or are they different from one prison to the next? Have you seen any deterioration? And what could the end game be? Could someone just really go to a vegetative state if they're in solitary?
It's one of those things that varies very, very widely between people. Some people will start hallucinating within a day. Other people won't hallucinate at all. Some people will become catatonic and stare at the wall. Some people won't. Some people will start self-harming quite early in the process. Some people won't. So it's the way human beings are, basically. You know, if you get 100 people in a room, you'll have 100 different reactions often to the same experience or a similar experience. So torture's like that. There's not a set series of stages people go through, other than really the reduction in brain activity. I mean, that's pretty much universal. And the trouble with that is you can't see it from the outside. If someone's hitting their head against the wall, you can see that. If they're catatonic, you can see that. If they're hallucinating, you can see that. You can't see from until it's quite progressed. You can't see it. I mean, we saw it on Monday because there's, as you say, Joe, about 1.5 years of essential solitary confinement gone into this, as well as years of the sensory deprivation, lack of sunlight and the lack of stimulation. You know, when you talked about being in a room for a few days and you feel disoriented, you need to go out and have a walk. It's partly the social aspect. It's also partly just you're in the same environment, your brain's just responding to the same four walls, nothing's moving. We need more stimulation than that for our nervous system to keep firing normally, basically.
I believe
that's another reason you need to go out and have a walk. So yeah, that stuff's sort of kind of universal. The brain needs that, just like everybody's body needs food and water. But the precise ways, you know, if someone's physical health is affected, some people might get, you know, might affect their stomach, might give them headaches, or might give them, you know, similar psychologically. The precise manifestations differ, but you know, it's the reduced brain activities and so associated mental cognitive impairments is one thing that everybody experiences.
So the common denominator with what Joe was asking, the common denominator, rather than there being set stages, would be that there is a profound effect at,
yes,
know, at relatively
exactly
quickly. Okay.
Yeah, and that, I mean, the UN's time frame is 15 days, which in a way is conservative if we know that after 7 days for some people the changes are permanent. So anything after 15 days is dangerous, and well, 7 days, you know, it shouldn't happen at all. But there's a reason people might think, oh, 2 weeks, that's a bit, you know, it's a bit soft. It's not. You know, the UN knows what it's talking about. There's a reason it says more than 2 weeks of solitary confinement is torture and cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment.
And to give some context as well, I know that there are some medical documents that WikiLeaks has published that I believe were penned by a dentist and a doctor that saw Assange, I believe a psychologist, and they were published in 2015, so long before this 1.5 years of solitary confinement, and he was already suffering the effects of this. He was already suffering, as you mentioned, the lack of like depth perception change, lack of distances and changing environment was already affecting his eyesight. So there are these really concrete effects that aren't even psychological in terms of, you know, feeling and cognition, but physicality
Yes.
that were already happening in 2015. So just
That's
as
right.
context for people that don't
Yeah.
remember that.
That's right. So we can't say we weren't warned. You know, we've been warned by people who know what they're talking about for years now. So it's really time. Independent media is doing a brilliant job. It's really time for establishment media to pull their finger out and realise, you know, it's good that there's been more reporting against the extradition, of course. That's really important, but that's not the only thing. People that, you know, the establishment media needs to stop being silent on the torture issue and on the reports and the warnings that are being issued about that. But, you know, I think that's an equally dire precedent that's being set.
Well, if it wasn't for that Ruptley cameraman running up to the vehicle Assange was in, we wouldn't have a single image of him.
Yes.
You know, and I thought, you know, looking at some of the court drawings that were done, it was almost generous the way they'd kind of filled out his cheeks a little bit compared with how he looked in that van. I thought that was really striking.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, which is subtle censorship, isn't it?
Lissa, since you're in Australia, can you bring us up to speed on this quite interesting development in Parliament where Andrew Wilkie, an MP who was himself a whistleblower, Brunel Gauffour, has actually gotten this committee together, I think of 10 or more MPs, to make a presentation or a demand of the Prime Minister to intervene in this case. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes, yeah, which is brilliant. I mean, that's the one, you know, ray of hope at the moment, you know, with respect to Julian Assange's case and situation. So there's, I mean, last I looked, it was 11 parliamentarians in Australia across the political spectrum who've come together to form a task force to work for the Australian government to bring Julian Assange to Australia, which is perfect. You know, I mean, there's arguments that Julian Assange isn't safe in Australia, but he's certainly not safe in the UK or in the US. It seems to be, I mean, it's the best option, especially if there are parliamentarians overseeing it and organising it. So they've issued some brilliant statements. Andrew Wilkie said after Monday's, you know, court proceedings that it was clear that authorities were seeking to break Julian Assange and they've almost succeeded. So he's not shying away from telling it like it is. So, and there's been some decent mainstream media reports in Australia since Andrew Wilkie brought that task force together, which is heartening. Again, sort of across the political spectrum in the media. I hope that continues. And so anybody all over the world who wants to do something, wants to assist, getting behind this task force of the 11 Australian MPs, I think is really critical because, you know, the more force they have behind them, the more likely they are to be successful. And there's some very experienced, depending on which side of politics you're on, but well-regarded politicians. You know, it's not just people on the fringes and the margins coming together to do this. And the fact that, you know, it's rare that you see politicians across the political spectrum really joining forces on an issue. And I think the thing that unites them is they all understand the very dire implications this has for democracy and for press freedom and for rule of law. And I think they all care more about that, it sounds like, or they care about that as much as their party affiliation, which is what is required. So that's very heartening to see. And that's one hopeful thing. And
that
good
is,
on them. Brilliant.
That is really important. That it goes across party lines. You know, I saw Wilkie on one of the shows, Australian TV show, Sunday, and he had some extraordinarily good things to say about Australia's relationship with the US, which is at the heart of this, of course. Which he said maybe Australia ought to say no once in a while.
Yes.
Because the United States is taking Australia for granted. And the fact that Scott Morrison has supposedly a friendship with Donald Trump, which is too weird to even contemplate that, but it could work, you know, in Assange's favor if the guy had the guts to take advantage of that relationship.
Yes.
Say, look, this is our citizen, bring him back, we want him back, you know. Or we're not going to agree on this or that. Just cause a rupture in the relationship. But right now, he says, Andrew Wilkie said, Scott Morrison is not the vice president of the United States. Then he added, I hope. I hope.
That's a very good point, yes. Yeah, and Andrew Wilkie knows politics. I mean, someone like me, I don't, you know, haven't been on that side of things. I don't know how things really work, but Andrew Wilkie does. I'm sure he knows what he's talking about when he says that. And, you know, psychologically, just in terms of people's relationships with each other, I mean, often people who are, you know, can mistreat people and be a little bit of a bully, will respect people who stand up to them. So, you know, you can do yourself damage by giving in too much to someone who's trying to push you around. So that's, yeah, just in terms of interpersonal dynamics, that's a really good point that he makes. He's saying some fabulous things. I mean, it's great that he's leading this task force, and you know, I really encourage anybody in Australia to write to your MP, write to your newspaper, write to your, you know, anybody you can think of to write to and call to get behind this task force, and to demand that the Australian government listen to these 11 parliamentarians and stand up for our sovereignty, our fellow citizen, you know, our civil rights, our democratic rights.
Well, the full statement from Wilkie from that TV show is on Consortium News. Anybody wants to see it. It was just a really, I transcribed and put the entire thing in there because I thought it was such an important, beyond Assange, just the relationship between a satellite like Australia and the US and how damaging that can be on so many different levels. Well, Elizabeth, if you have any more questions, we could.
I have one last one. This
yes,
is
please.
A statement. I just want to, as a, you know, for a final time, just reiterate that basically from, you know, returning back to your metaphorical comparison with the Colosseum and Rome and people being blindfolded and thrown to the lions. I just wanted to you know, have your comment on spelling out that when somebody says, whether they're tweeting it, whether they're writing it in an article or just stating it in a conversation with friends, when we say that Assange is being assassinated before our eyes, we're watching it happen in real time. Would you say that's an accurate assessment, even if there are no drugs involved whatsoever and it's only solitary confinement that we're talking about?
Yes, it is accurate. I tweeted that out after Monday, that Julian Assange's mother, Christine, wasn't exaggerating when she said quite a while back that her son's suffering a slow and cruel assassination before our eyes. It's exactly what we're watching. So, you know, everybody needs to really open their eyes to that. It's hard to open your eyes to that. It's difficult to believe. It's more believable in Australia, where we're in what Andrew Wilkie calls a pre-police state here. And it's a very ugly reality to open your eyes to, but it's important. I mean, you know, we're being warned all over the place from all kinds of people close to Julian, independent experts, you know, seeing it for our own eyes in court. It's not an exaggeration at all, no. Well,
it's great to get your perspective on that. Thank you for confirming that. I think that's really helpful for me, and I hope it's helpful for our audience as well to hear that from your perspective as a professional.
I hope so too.
Well, thank you, Lisa, for joining us and giving me my social interaction today. It was the first I've had. So I thank Elizabeth for that too. Feel a little better right now, but not about Julian Assange, of course. So thanks again, Liz. Thanks again for joining us.
Okay, thank you both.
Thank you.